Hello there. This is Emily Muse, producer of Education Insights Focus on Behavior and the Behavior Education Connection. We are so glad you're here today. We have a great episode in store, but before we dive in, we do have a favor to ask. We would love your help in spreading the word about our podcast. So if you have enjoyed the content here, please feel free to share our shows and episodes with others who might enjoy them, and to make sure that you are subscribed and liking our episodes wherever you listen to podcasts. We can't say enough about how much of a difference that makes in helping us spread the word, and we appreciate your help. So, without any further ado, let's dive into today's episode.
Hello, and welcome to the Behavior Education Connection, the podcast that works to connect the world of behavior analysis and the world of education. We focus on topics important to behavior analysts who work in the public schools and those who support them. Join us and spend time gaining insights and ideas as our host talks with fellow behavior analysts as well as other experts in the field.
Hello, welcome back again to the Behavior Education Connection. I'm your host, Dr. Selena Layden, and I am joined by two guests today, Courtney Wolfson. Hi, Courtney.
Hi, everyone.
And Jessica Olsevich. Hi, Jessica.
Hello.
Courtney, do you mind starting off just introducing yourself today?
Of course. So as Selena mentioned, I'm Courtney Wolfson. I am currently an assistant principal in Fairfax County Public Schools. I started off my career as a special education teacher working in an autism classroom. And I worked in a classroom for 5 years. And then from there, I moved into a new role called an ABA coach, where my main responsibilities were supporting the staff in our autism and low incidence classrooms with applied behavior analysis, teaching techniques and principles. And I was in that role for 10 years. And then I decided to take the journey on to be an administrator. And this is now my first year in this role. So happy to be here.
Great, thank you. And just to also add, you are a BCBA, so.
Yes, correct. Thank you for that clarification. Yes.
Of course, of course. And Jessica, do you mind introducing yourself?
Sure. I'm Jessica Olsevich. I am an assistant principal in Stafford County Public Schools. Similar to Courtney, I started off as a special education teacher. Fun fact, Courtney and I actually crossed paths at Penn State. We did some of our undergraduate work together.
Yes, we are.
I was a special education teacher, I think also for 5 years. And then when I left the classroom, I went to central office as a behavior analyst in 2 different divisions. So somewhat similar to Courtney, but I would travel around across both counties that I worked in at separate times, supporting different cases that school-based teams needed some help on, basically doing FBAs and writing BIPs. And I did that for, I think it was like a total of 6 years or so across the 2 different divisions before I moved into an assistant principal at Conway Elementary. And this is my 4th year here. So I feel like I've hit a groove a little bit. I kind of know the ups and downs of the year, while Courtney may be still like experiencing it as a first time or whatever. But yeah.
Well, I'm glad to have you both here. And you're specifically here because a lot of times school-based BCBAs do lots and lots of different things in public schools, but not many of them, at least that I know, go into building administration, which both of you have decided to do. So I guess I want to start out with saying, why did you decide building administration was the route to go for you?
Sure. I'll start on this one if you're okay with that, Courtney. So I, when I left the classroom to go to central office, it was a hard decision. I really liked having my 8 caseload of kids, but at that time, I really felt like I had a skill set where I needed to reach more kids. And I feel like it was somewhat a similar decision whenever I decided to come to the school. From central office, I kind of felt like I had a skill set that I wanted to reach a certain community consistently every day. I really liked being in central office and being able to see lots of different school settings and all the great things that happen in our public schools. However, I didn't have like a home community, even though I was welcomed in all the schools that I came to.
Sure.
I really wanted to find that community again. And I really thought that my skill set was going to be able like to be at one place consistently over a few years. And that's ultimately why I made the decision. The road to get there for me was a little bit different. I like had my second kid and the county was like, hey, we have this cohort. And I was like, oh, I think I want to go to administration eventually. So yeah, I'll join that cohort. And then the cohort finished up and this position became open. And the person who I was like working underneath was like, oh, hey, you should just apply for it. It'd be a great like interview experience. And then like I ended up with a position. And so I didn't really think I would find myself here like so quickly. But I did, and I'm happy I did. So yeah, that's how I ended up here.
Nice.
So similarly to Jess, I started off as a special education teacher, and I really went into education because I just had that passion and joy to be able to support our students grow and succeed and have access and opportunity. And same thing, I had about 8 students in my classroom each year. And throughout my years, I saw the impact that I could make on those 8 students. And I wanted to take that, skill set and be able to make a bigger impact. And that's when I moved into that coaching role, because I went from having 8 students to supporting about 15 to 20 classrooms per year with 8 students in each classroom. So if you think about the math there, that's a lot more students that I could then have impact on. And throughout my years as a coach, I also found that joy in just supporting staff and adults in learning, best teaching practices and utilizing applied behavior analysis skills to be able to support any and every learner. And so, when I finished up my administration endorsement, I was like, what better opportunity to take my 2 passions, seeing students succeed and building relationships with students, and then also supporting and coaching staff being the best educators they can be, and combine that into one role as a building administrator. I thought, what better of an opportunity? And to, add on to Jess too, like you just have this sense of community where you build by being, in one location. And, the same thing, I was welcomed in every school that I was ever in, but, now having that sense of community where I can, take my 2 joys and put it into one role, I feel very fortunate and lucky to have.
Well, I think it's awesome. And I really, like I said, there are a few of you, but I don't know as many building administrators who are also behavior analysts. But I actually think that the skill sets are well suited for each other. And so my next question for you all is, so how does being a behavior analyst help you in your role as a building administrator?
I can chime in here. I think it can help in a variety of ways. Data analysis, first and foremost, as a building administrator, you're consistently working with a variety of teams on analyzing data, academics, social emotional behavior data, attendance data. And I think the skill sets in data analysis really serves itself well to this role. In addition to that, I think the knowledge of just, behavior and understanding, things like reinforcement and feedback not only helps you collaborate with staff on, systems, whether it's building-wide systems or classroom systems or even individual student systems to help students succeed and see that academic and social emotional achievement, but also even just supporting staff. In no way would I ever say that I'm an OBM expert, but with trainings and experiences with OBM and how that derives out of ABA, and looking at how can you support your teams in a building in achieving their goals and learning the skills that they're working on to best support the students is ultimately the overarching goal. And so I do think, and those are just a few things. I'm going to let Jess tag in too, because I'm sure she has more. But those are just so many of the, skills and principles that we, every day interact with as in this role.
Yeah, I think the one thing to kind of piggyback off what Courtney said, like building relationships, like really understanding how we build relationships and, um, how we can pair with big people and little people alike, and provide reinforcement. And, a lot of times reinforcement for our staff is maybe like reducing the work effort it takes to get to an end goal, and I think like we understand that as behavior analysts. And so it's very natural for us to, employ that in our building of relationships with staff. And I use like the word consistency a lot too. I know prior to this position, I did a lot of professional development with teachers. And sometimes, when you're talking about behavior change, people, you say, well, it takes time. And I was like, yeah, it takes time and consistency. Like it doesn't just take time. You can't just let, 2 weeks go by. It takes consistency of adult behavior, changing behavior, implementing things. And like, so same on this side of being a building administrator and building a culture and a community. It takes time of like consistent, leadership behaviors. When I came to Conway, I think the first year I put in the staff lounges an infographic by, I think it's like Bias Behavioral, and it's like the 4-to-1 ratio, and it kind of explains it. But it's a nice little just infographic, because I would say that to teachers a lot about like how you build relationships with kids. We say that a lot. We say build a relationship with a kid, have a positive relationship, but we don't say how to do it. So I think like the 4-to-1 ratio is a really good example of that. And you can get more technical and like give discrete examples of, different positive interactions that you may have with a kid across the school day. And it was like the second year that I was here, there was a teacher who like referenced the infographic, and I was like, oh, that's cool. That's me. Like I did something, and it was clearly something that she would like think about a lot, but then also became like fluent in her thinking about how to interact with students. She's like, because I understand, you have to, the infographic has like balloons behind the kids. Like, I don't want to pop their balloons. I want to try to give them as many balloons. So when I do have to pop a balloon, like there are still balloons there and stuff. So anyway, I guess I got off a little bit of a tangent there, but as building administrators, even implementing, like building relationships, like I said, with big people or little people, we would probably go in our previous role, Courtney and I, and talk about the 4-to-1 ratio and like coach teachers on doing that. But then we're also able to like use it with our staff, with our students, consistently. And I think that is across the board for a lot of different behavior analytic principles. Like you said, Selena, the roles pair well.
Can I chime in too and add one more? I think our experience and knowledge within ABA around objectivity is something that is very important in this role. Thinking about, whether you're going into classroom observations, to whether you're supporting staff with feedback, like that behavior specific feedback that we are, so used to utilizing, not just for, students, but also for staff as well, I think is very important. And I think it's something that not only helps like our students learn, but helps our, adults kind of understand the process as well. Whenever I go into a classroom and talk with a teacher about an observation, I always start off with saying, I just want you to know, I know this is a snapshot. And I recognize that a lot of things happen before and a lot of things happen behind the scenes and a lot of things happen afterwards. I just recall like what I see so that we can collaborate. And I think that kind of helps with really identifying, whether it's, hey, these are the great things that went well, or here are some things we might want to try. I think that objectivity is crucial within this role. And I'm grateful to have that background and kind of doing that for a little while.
Yeah, I think you all brought up a lot of really great answers. Not that there's one right answer by any means, but I think, like I said, I think that the skill sets overlap really well. And I don't know that a lot of school-based behavior analysts immediately think to go into building administration. And in fact, I'll be honest, I had no desire to go into building administration because there are lots of pieces that are not as reinforcing for me that you all have to deal with, right? Like textbooks and lunch counts and some of those things that are still part of the job, important, but but well suited for different people enjoy different things for sure. But I want to reiterate, and you both already said this, you both went through an administrator program. You have an administrator license. So understanding that you had to learn that skill set before you could become an administrator. But what are some things that have been potentially just challenging for you as you've come into these roles, or things that you've had to really kind of ponder and work through and reconcile with your behavior analytic knowledge and experience as well?
Mhm. I think some of this is like fresh on my mind because I might be experiencing a little bit of it now, but so that's good. I think when it comes to like responding to behavior, I do have two different, like, I don't want to say hats because I'm never taking off a hat and putting on another hat. Like they're both always on. So that's maybe not the best. But there are some times when I know things about this student's background as an administrator because, like, we've gotten a student and he has a file and I read it and I know he's experienced some things in life and I'm responding to him as an administrator because the teacher needs help, but like as a behavior analyst, I'm like, I know I need to work on building this relationship and kind of going through a bit of, I'm not trying to say like I'm a counselor. I don't want to use the word therapeutic, but like I can't just come in as an administrator and be like, oh, here's a consequence, here you go. When like there's this whole learning history that this student has experienced that I know just a little bit about. And trying to like find the balance of the both when like as administrator, I know what my calendar is in the back of my head and how many observations I have to do today and how many, like feedback meetings I have to have. But like this kid, that this moment of me being called to the classroom is going to eat into that stuff. But like
Right.
what's right for now is that like I have to focus on this and I can't just be like, okay, I got to get you out of here. We got to issue a consequence and we're done. It's like, but it's more. So I sometimes have like internal battle with that. And I'm very fortunate. There's another AP that works here at the school with me because we're so large. And so sometimes like she'll come and support and like I'll talk through some things with her and then she's able to pick up off and I run and then I do the same for her. So in the end, I feel okay with like the way that it goes, but it's always like in my head, like, oh my gosh, what is this pulling me away from as an administrator? But as a behavior analyst, I know I need to like be here in this moment. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's that idea of conflicting roles almost, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like whose reinforcement do I need to make sure I'm making happen right now?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a great way to put it, Selena. I would say for me, especially being a first year assistant principal, I would say, and I wouldn't necessarily say challenging, but something that I'm just constantly learning. And I'm in that learner stance right now. And I think, coming from my background with special education and behavior analysis, like it was such and I don't want to say niche because behavior analysis goes across everything, but like as far as the population of students that I might have worked with, or the staff or the classrooms that I worked in, and now being, expanding it and being able to take this knowledge and, see how it intertwines with, so many different layers within a school system, not just behavior, but, academics, social emotional skills, attendance, graduation. There's just so many layers that kind of just are embedded within. So, I'm just constantly learning and I love that. It's something I've, always, enjoyed, which is why I continue to go back to school and continue to learn new and take on new positions. But I think it's something that, that's kind of, what I'm experiencing right now.
Mm. Courtney, I'm going to jump in real quick too, because you've brought it up a few times. You said the word attendance. And I think that again is like I'll use the word challenge a little bit because at the elementary level, and I'm sure to some extent and still a lot of an extent at the secondary and high school level, we need our kids in the building in order to like teach them. And we have some kids that have like some chronic attendance issues. So we do have a really good system here at our school. Like in our county, we have the highest attendance rates. And so we're super proud of that. But it's because we work so closely with families on giving them knowledge on like the importance of attendance and, the skills that we're teaching and like modeling for our kids. I think the challenge is like for elementary attendance, when a student isn't coming to school very often, I'm working with like the family a lot, right? Or like the parents, and same at the secondary level, right? There's always, it's not like just the kid like getting up and like being responsible for themselves and like getting out the door. But I think that is a challenge, is like, it's just another layer of trying to like work with someone else. And the previous principal I worked with, and I think he is totally right. He said, like when a student has attendance issues, that is just like the symptom, like there is something else going on. Right. So like, what else can we help the family with? And it's like kind of digging into that problem and trying to problem solve that. But sometimes it's just hard, like getting access to those to certain parents, because maybe they're not picking up their phones, and I'm texting and I'm emailing and please come into the school or like meet with us, virtually or something like that, and trying to work with them. And it's a challenge sometimes that is a barrier when it's like, we just want your kid here every day because this is where they need to be.
But I think that that's also such a good opportunity to bring those behavior analytics skills in, right? Like, what is the function of this behavior, right? And how do we leverage reinforcement to make school hopefully a more reinforcing place, which is oftentimes, especially I think as we get into middle and high school, maybe not the case for some of our students. We have longer learning histories, and school maybe isn't the most reinforcing place that it was when I was a 5-year-old kindergartner and I got to color and hang out with my friends all day kind of thing. Kindergartners do way more than that these days, but often most 5-year-olds are much more reinforced by school, I think, than they are sometimes when they get into high school. So,
and I think it goes back to our very first question about that relationship building piece, and like, how do we, start that from the start? Or how do I start that from the start? How do you build that in right from the start so that students have those adults that they, trust, have those adults that they see that they are supported by, and really, pairing school with some of those positive motivators.
Just going back to, part of the reason you all said that you really like the roles that you're in is it's a stable community, right? And so, what does that mean for our students as well? Because I remember the days of traveling from school to school, and everyone was always nice. I never felt unwelcome, but I wasn't always part of that school.
Right.
And that's different.
Yeah. Right. And what I was going to say, Courtney, you had said something that made me think too, like, how do you build that off from the start? We're not just doing that with students. We're doing it with our staff, and then with also parents, like in the families, in the community. So just today, I was so happy. We got a new student like right before Thanksgiving break. So he hasn't been here that much, but some behavior challenges, but I was able to make a positive phone call home today to that parent. I was like, I'm jumping on this like right now, because I think that's one thing, like, as a disciplinarian too, I make a lot of phone calls that are like not positive, or like, hey, I had to talk to your kid today about this. And I don't do that as often. And I want to try to like, increase that. That's going to be a goal for mine in 2026. But I did get to make a positive phone call today, and that was like so helpful. And the parent was just so like, he picked up the phone. He was like, oh, what now? I was like, no. This is a good phone call. Like, I'm going to go down there. I make good phone calls too. Like, and yeah, so it's just like building that relationship too, like feels really good. And I was just happy that I was able to like jump on that opportunity.
I love that, Jess.
Yeah.
So I guess I would ask both of you, if you were a school-based behavior analyst or talking to a school-based behavior analyst who's like, I might be interested in becoming a building administrator, what do you think about it? What's some advice you would give them?
I would say do it.
I would say shadow, like, take the opportunity to kind of walk through a day of an administrator. I was fortunate to do that actually at the school that I'm at now with another assistant principal. And, you kind of get to see all the different roles that you play. And then I would say after you shadow, like step back and reflect and think about, okay, like what are the things that I love about being a behavior analyst and how can I embed that into this role? What might be some things that are different and kind of just weigh out all the different variables because it's going to be for some people, it's not going to be for other people. And so I think getting that exposure and that opportunity to kind of walk in, the shoes of somebody else, but then also think about all of the different variables, I think that would be my advice.
I
Yeah.
really love that. And I think, just as I think there are people that are like, well, I went to school, so clearly I know what happens in schools, right? And as those of us that work in schools know that that's not quite how life works. I think sometimes there is a perception of, well, I've worked with administrators, I've seen administrators, I clearly know what they do all day. And I think you're right. I'm not sure that we fully do understand the day-to-day and minute-to-minute expectations of a lot of administrators. That for some people, I think fit them and their personality and their skill set really well, and for some people may not. And so I agree. I think getting to know what that means before you jump headfirst into that role. And I
Yeah.
would even add, being a high school administrator is not the same as being a middle school administrator, is not the same as being an elementary school administrator. Those are also very different roles,
Yeah.
and what that means and what that looks like every day.
Just today I had I'll have people who are like in administrative programs reach out to me, hey, can I come shadow you? Because you have to get like X amount of hours.
Mhm.
And so I had a high school English teacher shadowing me today, and she was like, it is very different down here. And I was like, listen, Courtney, I should probably come shadow you sometime. Like, I don't know what you all do all day. And I don't mean like you're sitting around not doing anything. I can only imagine what you're dealing with
Yeah.
day-to-day basis. And yeah.
I think
I
that's
also
a good point though, is like, recognizing that every grade level, and I always tell people, I actually just gave this advice to somebody that's exploring it, is like, you know, expose yourself to each grade level, elementary, middle, and high, because never say never, never close a door, because you don't actually know until you get that exposure, until you get that experience. And not to say that one day of shadowing is going to give you that experience, but I always say just don't shut a door because you want to see all your opportunities before you make a decision.
yeah.
Yeah.
The other advice I would give is I feel like I always give these on podcasts too, is like listen to podcasts.
But if
There's
you're
a
a
few.
podcast person, you're a podcast person,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah, exactly. There's a few different out there, like Crisis in Education. Oh, sugar, there's another one too. And it is like behavior analysts who have experience in administration in school talking about, like organizational behavior management, or just, different, like how the two overlap and whatnot. I find myself listening to that and being and like envisioning what I could use and like, oh, that's a good idea, or even just like talking to the podcast while I was like, yeah. So if you find yourself doing those things while you're listening, maybe you're like, oh, this is a sign, like maybe I should go down this road.
Yeah, I think just exploring your resources that you have available to you, whether those are, to Courtney's earlier point, people resources of who are people that I know that are in these roles who can give me good insight. Are there books? Are there podcasts? Are there, online resources? I think always having a fully rounded like understanding of what you're getting into, knowing that you can never fully understand what you're getting into till you get there. But
For sure.
I do think that that's really helpful. I mean, I would say that for anybody who's even a behavior analyst who's like, I might be interested in schools, figure out what a school behavior analyst does, and not just one, many of them, because they all do different things. Because for some people, it's a great fit and it works really well. And for some people, they get into it and they're like, this is not what I thought I would be doing all day, and it's not what I want to do. And that's totally fine. That's what I think one of the great things about our field is it can be applied in so many different ways. And so finding what works for you and what makes sense for you, I think is really critical. So I guess with that, I think we're wrapping up a nice conversation. Do you all have anything that you want to add before we sign off today?
I just add that if anyone is interested, feel free to reach out. I'd be glad to chat more. I'm sure Jess would too, not to speak for you,
Yep,
Jess,
same
but
here.
um, but I'd be glad to talk more about what the transition looked like from a previous role to this role and just kind of how can you embed, the principles of applied behavior analysis into a role such as this. So.
Mm-hmm. I think I would say too, like I try as much as possible to like stay rooted in the science because it really does help to like guide my decisions. As an administrator, like I said, I never take off my BCB hat, and I really don't take off my administrator hat too. I'm not like switching back and forth. I am both, and I can be both, and I think that really helps me. Also, like this is maybe like a little bit cheesy, but just like find joy in something that you do each day. I know like just in the educational field in general, that's one thing that like my assistant principal and I have been working on like personally for ourselves. So like whether it's at work, I'm going to find one, or maybe at home, or, I'm going for a walk or something, or like watching the sunrise and sunset on a day, just at one point of your day, make sure you're finding joy like every day.
I think that's a really positive, great note to end on, actually. So
I agree.
So with that, Courtney and Jessica, thank you so much for your time today. I think this was a really great conversation. And I think, as we continue to explore a lot of what makes school-based behavior analysts and what that looks like, I think that this is a really unique facet, but one that I wish more people would consider, actually. So Jessica, thank you.
You're welcome.
Courtney, thank you as well.
Thank you.
And to our listeners, we will see you on our next episode.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Behavior Education Connection. Join us next time for another great conversation about behavior analysis in the schools. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on an episode. Sending out a special thanks to the Virginia Department of Education for supporting our work. We look forward to connecting with you all again soon.